most countries will have mutual recognition agreements with each other for a host of things. And there's no reason why the UK and the EU can't do all of those things. And in fact, it's very much in both of their interests to do that.
Welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh, and I'm the head of public policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question, is global Britain dead? In recent weeks, the free trading vision of Britain's future has been taking a hammering. Former Environment Secretary George Eustice has slammed the trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. The new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has also previously raised questions during the summer leadership contest. Meanwhile, it seems like the much hoped for US deal is out of reach, and we've seen other deals like the likes of India and CPTPP delayed. To discuss this, I think, very important topic, I'm excited to be joined by Shanker A Singham, who's the IEA Trade Fellow, an extensive author and public commentator, and world-leading trade and competition lawyer. Shanker also played a key role in debates about Brexit and Britain's place in the world. So Shanker, just before we get onto some of the interesting debates about trade deals and the Australia question, I'm interested to get your views on the state of Brexit, that perennial issue that we thought we would someday finish talking about, but seems to have taken up again in public debate. There seems to be a lot of discussion that Brexit is somehow behind the current economic woes the UK is facing, or at the very least, making things worse. What do you make of that debate?
Well, I mean, what is Brexit? Brexit was a decision by the UK to leave the European Union. That's all it was. Now, what you do with that decision will determine, obviously, your economic future. And I think at the outset, what the UK needed to do was essentially in two buckets. One was you've got to maximize the opportunities that freedom provides, and you've got to minimize the disruptions that inevitably come from leaving a customs union, which is a major thing to do with regard to your border management. So the question is, has any of that happened, in the last 6 years? And so if we look through that sort of sequentially, in terms of maximizing opportunities, we have started. I think I'd give the UK a sort of 7 or 8 out of 10, perhaps, on the external trade policy. Because they have started, and they have actually re-envisaged what their trade policy would be. In other words, they've done the things you have to do. They've done the rollover of deals with countries and so on, but they've done a lot more. They've actually got a vision of what the UK's independent trade policy role will be, including the CPTPP accession, which is really important. And that was, when that was first suggested, people thought that was completely crazy because, the UK is not a Pacific nation, as I was reminded on frequent occasions. But, it is what people are, I think, beginning to realise is that actually CPTPP is the major regional, and actually even more than regional now, trade liberalizing initiative in the world, and it is challenging, countries in the WTO to do more. And without it, that wouldn't be happening. So that's why it's so important. That's why it was kept alive when the US pulled out of it. That's why the Japanese have taken leadership of it. And so I think the UK has done reasonably well on its trade policy agenda. The biggest area of opportunity, though, of course, is regulatory reform and domestic regulatory reform, which is linked somewhat to the trade agenda, because you have to have an open regulatory system in order to do quick and deep trade deals. But regulatory reform is something you do, for yourself. I mean, it is what's going to grow your own economy. And there, I think it's a 0 out of 10, because they have done nothing. I mean, there has been nothing on the regulatory reform agenda, and unfortunately, the previous Prime Minister, who did have that as I think her primary goal, only lasted a very short time. So and largely fell because of objections to any kind of change to the status quo by various people who benefit from the status quo, which is always what happens with reform. So 0 out of 10 on regulatory reform, and then what about the minimizing disruption side of things? Well, probably a 4 out of 10 on that. There has been some efforts to do border management. You do have a lot of commitments to Best Border 2025, the single trade window, which is going forward, management of our ecosystems of trust and so on. So there are some things in that particular bucket that are happening. But you really, if you're going to have a good future, you have to have a 10 out of 10 in all of those boxes. So what are we? We're sort of 7 on the trade side, 0 on the regulatory reform side, maybe 4 on the management of the border side, which is not. It's just not. It's not there. So when you say is it dead? Well, let's see what happens when you get closer to a 10 out of 10 on each of those buckets, and then you can start assessing how successful or not it is being. So I think I know that people say, well, you've had 6 years. Well, I think that's the time you've had is sort of irrelevant. What matters is what have you done with the time. The project will be judged once you are getting close to 10 out of 10 in each of those different buckets, and then we'll see what happens. If you're
I mean,
doing all of those things, then what happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's also going to be a long-term question of what happens with the EU and whether or not the UK, by being a sovereign country and making its own laws and its own decisions, can achieve better outcomes as opposed to following the EU bloc and what that freedom means. I think that there is this current debate, and I think it's legitimate and fair and reasonable to suggest that in the short run, Brexit is damaging to the UK economy. I don't think there's really any way to avoid that. If you're going to do a clean break with the EU, that you're going to have a disruption in trade. You do see these stories the FT likes to talk about now or you see it on Twitter, that a local shop selling Greek food has had to shut down because of the customs cost of dealing with. It feels like some of that self-imposed, though. The UK self-imposed a customs block barriers, and it could be much better on the border with the EU and far more liberalizing. Or, for example, on mutual recognition of EU standards, we could keep that going for even longer. We've extended it a bit. Yeah. There's no reason that we have to put up barriers to the EU.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things here. So first of all, for reasons that are, were reasonable at the time, the UK did not ask for very much in the trade agreement with the EU, and therefore, if you look at the EU-UK TCA, other than very specific areas around the level playing field stuff, it's a very, very thin trade agreement compared with other agreements. For example, compared with the most modern, most liberalizing one, which is CPTPP, there is a lot more in the TPP on liberalization, particularly in services and mutual recognition and so on. Now, does that mean it's set in stone? I think people have this vision that whatever was agreed, nothing will ever change. And actually, there's no trade agreement that doesn't develop and grow and new things get, added to it. There is a committee under each of these chapters. There's a customs and trade facilitation committee that, is driving for single, window with both sides, which would lower those customs costs you talked about considerably. There are mutual recognition. Most countries will have mutual recognition agreements with each other for a host of things. And there's no reason why the UK and the EU can't do all of those things. And in fact, it's very much in both of their interests to do that. The problem is that we're not going to make any progress on the TCA until we resolve the issues in Northern Ireland. So the Northern Ireland Protocol is sort of the gate through which all of this has to go. That has to get resolved first, and then I think the EU will be more willing to cooperate on some of these things that are in its interests anyway to do. So, for example, New Zealand and the EU have a veterinary agreement that is mutual recognition of even underlying product regulations. So they have different SPS rules in the area of food and so forth, and yet they're able to recognize each other's regulatory systems. Now, that doesn't eliminate all checks. It just allows you to be very, very, it lowers the intensity of checks considerably, and it doesn't eliminate all paperwork, but it does allow some creative things like digitization of export health certificates and so on. to be developed. So it smooths the trade considerably. That type of agreement, if the New Zealanders and the EU can agree it, surely the UK and the EU can agree something like that, because the starting position is the same. And while we are, we reserve the right to change our SPS rules because, frankly, the EU is not in compliance with WTO on some of its SPS rules, and we would certainly at least want to be in compliance with the WTO and more. Our fundamental goals of SPS, health and safety regulations, and so on, is never going to change. I mean, we're always going to have the goal of, protecting the health and life, of people and animals and so on. So, but you can achieve those goals in very, very different ways, and that's where the EU's, reliance on and heavy use of the precautionary principle and hazard-based approaches to these things is not the way that most countries do things, particularly modern countries that are big traders in the world, particularly in agriculture, and we need to be more aligned with them. But you made a very good point earlier on that I just wanted to pick up, which was the battle. I mean, there is a battle beyond all of the things we're discussing narrowly with respect to countries for the world's operating system. And so the battle is not between the EU's regulatory system and the US's regulatory system and China's regulatory system, as it often is sort of posited. The battle is actually between your approach to interoperation of your regulatory systems. Do you have a harmonization first approach, which is favored by the EU? In other words, if you want access to my market, you will have to you will have to sort of mimic or copy my regulatory system, which is, as I say, favored by the EU. Or do you have the approach that's favored by countries like the US and Australia and New Zealand and the CPTPP countries, which is, as long as the end goals are the same, regulatory, recognition of those systems, equivalence and adequacy is the way forward. And that's how countries interoperate. And that allows regulatory competition, which is much more likely to get your regulatory system to be on the sort of consumer welfare enhancing, generating the most economic growth, generating the most economic activity, benefiting consumers and getting all those balances right. Whereas harmonization is much less likely. It's not impossible, but is much less likely to achieve that outcome. And that's where the UK, as a major G7 nation, has sort of emerged. It's sort of emerged on the chessboard out of nothing, really. And it's the question for the UK is: are you going to be a queen on the chessboard, or are you going to be a pawn? And right now, we're behaving like we're going to be a pawn.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is effectively what you're saying there is also the case against the kind of mooted Swiss-style arrangement with the EU, which would require a lot more effective alignment with the EU's regulatory orbit and would completely defeat, in my view at least, the point of Brexit, which is you've got to be able to do that divergence and those third-party deals. But talking of those third-party deals, what's gotten the most controversy in recent history was those comments from George Eustice about the Australia and New Zealand deals. Shanker, I'm interested, what do you think? Did the UK give away too much for too little in return, as he suggested?
Okay, well, just picking up on your Swiss point first. The difficulty is people, I think, tend to view things in terms of countries, whereas as I've always said, agreements between these sorts of countries are words on a page. They're not sort of defined by these models. Even there is no such thing as the Swiss model. There's a series of changing agreements, about 80, 90 agreements that the Swiss have with the EU, and they voluntarily align through those agreements, as you said. And it's not, I mean, if you view it through the lens of the buckets I sort of put I sort of described at the beginning of this, then what do you gain from the Swiss, from, let's say, a voluntary alignment of regulation with the EU? You don't gain, as people sometimes think, suddenly there's no customs barriers. No, the customs process stays exactly the same. In fact, so if you look at this with regard to Northern Ireland, a Swiss deal would not change the customs process between GB and Northern Ireland at all. Not one iota. Would it lower the number of physical checks that SPS goods would undergo? Yes, it would. But it wouldn't take them away. So right now they're about 1%. So it would be a very little change would be gained by that decision. So in the gain box, there's virtually nothing. In the loss box, as you pointed out, the moment you voluntarily align to European SPS regulation, you're no longer in control of your regulatory system. That means you cannot accede to things like the CPTPP, because obviously you're making commitments about your regulatory system in the CPTPP and the good regulatory practice chapter and in various other chapters, and you don't have authority over that if you're the UK. So if I'm a CPTPP member, I would say, well, hang on a second, you can't accede to this language. You don't have authority to accede to this language, so you can't join the CPTPP. Nor, and I would suggest that it would actually compromise what we've already agreed with the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Japanese. It would mean you couldn't really do much more than we've already done with the Canadians and the Mexicans, and you certainly wouldn't ever be able to do anything with the US. So in the loss bucket, there is a massive amount of loss, and I haven't even said all of the things like gene editing and synthetic biology and all the things we were going to do in terms of improving our SPS regulation. You would lose all of that. And ambassadors from WTO countries have frequently said to me, we're still not really sure which side of the table you're going to be on when you emerge as an independent trading nation. Are you going to be a sort of mini Europe, or are you going to be actually a genuine liberalizer of trade, force for liberalization? Well, if we were to do this, we would be telling them exactly which side of the table we would be on, and we would be another mini EU. And I don't think anyone in the global trading system would like another EU in the global trading system. So in the loss bucket, it's massive. In the gain bucket, it's virtually nothing. So why would you do it?
Yeah.
So in terms of
the Australia deal loss and gain. What was lost and what was gained?
So I'd make a threshold point here, which is the way we talk about trade deals in these highly mercantilist terms of, and trade negotiators, tend to do this. They refer to tariff reductions as concessions that they give.
Just to those lawyers, they're awful trade lawyers.
Even though, yeah, absolutely. Even though even though obviously lowering your tariff is advantageous to your consumers. So I'd make that sort of threshold comment that it's we shouldn't think of things in those mercantilist terms anyway, because actually liberalizing is good for you in and of itself. It's very much, your regulatory agenda is very similar to that, your domestic regulatory reform agenda. This is stuff that you're doing. It's not a concession. It's you can view domestic regulation in sort of protectionist terms as well, but you're protecting powerful incumbents who benefit from the status quo. There's the same kind of logic. So the first thing I would say is, first of all, let's get away from this language of mercantilism on this. So it's not about gains and losses. The second thing I would say is the UK is the only country I know of where the Agriculture Ministry actually has a seat at the negotiating table on specific issues. Now, in every other country, absolutely, the Agriculture Ministry is able to weigh in with the trade negotiating process, but ultimately it's one person, the trade negotiator, who is at the table, because it's the trade negotiator that has the bird's eye view of the whole economy, and the concessions, to put it in the mercantilist language again, in some areas may lead to gains in other areas that are actually very important for the country. So it's only the trade negotiator at the table at the moment of the negotiation who can make those snap decisions. Now, the problem the UK has is you've got the Agriculture Ministry at the table. Well, the Agriculture Ministry doesn't really care, and rightly so. They don't care about anything other than agriculture. And in the case of the UK, they're also the Environment Ministry, so they only care about that as well. They don't care about financial services. They don't care about exports of products that aren't agricultural. They don't care about any of those things, and nor should they, because that's not their mandate. But you don't put them at the negotiating table. It's a fundamental flaw of the negotiating mechanics that the UK has, and we will continue to get these problems until that is changed and brought into international best practice. Not just international best practice, but everybody's everybody's practice around the world. So I think when George says we lost too much and gained too little, he's only talking about his own sphere. He can only be talking about his own sphere because the DEFRA doesn't have a view on the extent of services liberalization that you should seek to have, or data liberalization, or any of those things that are actually key and major parts of the Australia deal. And actually, if you look at all the areas of the Australia and New Zealand deals that DEFRA was in charge of, in the first place, there are some. I mean, I would have some concerns, and I think in the TAC, I'm a commissioner on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, have reviewed those agreements, and I think in our report we noted that the Australia deal, there's an argument it's SPS minus. So the purpose of the UK is to liberalize. If you accept the purpose of the UK is to liberalize and go sort of WTO plus on a lot of these areas, in other words, more liberalizing than the WTO floor, the Australia deal, the SPS chapter, is less than the WTO floor. So it's a negative contribution to liberalization. Well, that's not the fault of DIT, because DIT wasn't at the table. That was DEFRA. If you look at the environmental provisions, they are, they are the most wide-ranging and deep environmental provisions of any agreement anywhere, and they're backed by full dispute settlement, which, other than USMCA, is not true of any trade agreement. So how you can say, from an environmental standpoint, you've not got everything you wanted, strikes me as somewhat bizarre, because it is, as I say, more than anyone else.
So what you're saying is, even in George Eustice's own terms, this is, even if what you're concerned about is being protectionist and or at least helping the kind of agriculture industry, there's full liberalization in most things, not for 15 years, and there's all these other things about the environment that should also be of DEFRA's interest. So he's not really
there's
the deal in the right way.
And there's an animal welfare chapter, which there hasn't been in any other agreement. So DEFRA essentially got everything it wanted, pretty much. The only thing that the Australia deal, where it does differ from the EU's style of deals, is in the commitment to tariff-free, quota-free, but as you said, over a 15-year transition period with a special safeguard.
I also find it quite extraordinary that the extent to which this just reveals exactly what George Eustice was working for, because we got a lot of the claims from the NTU, from other protectionists, that, oh no, this is actually just about animal rights and environmental standards. We have really specific concerns about the way Australia treat such and such environmental issue. He didn't even try to use that fig leaf of an argument. He basically just said, no, we were too free trading. We should have just protected a specific industry. I mean, to me, that just sounds like blatant rent seeking. It doesn't sound like anyone who has any interest in what is generally good for the British consumer or would be good trade policy.
Yeah, and clearly on the TAC, we went through all the arguments about Australia's standards. I mean, that's what the TAC is focused on. All the arguments about Australia's standards, all the arguments about very specific practices that happen in Australia. And our conclusion was that there's almost nothing that is a lower standard than the UK. And in fact, as you'd expect, I mean, Australia and New Zealand standards are very high. So the standards argument is not an argument in my view. It is just a question of protecting local UK farmers, and I think on that score there are indeed export opportunities for those farmers in these deals. I mean, if you look at what New Zealand's dairy farmers were able to accomplish as a result of liberalization, they've gone from virtually being an industry on its back to controlling, producing 3% of the world's milk, but controlling something like 30% of the world's dairy. And what they've been able to do, and what British farmers, I think, could do if they put their minds to it, is a similar exercise of identifying the value generating elements of the supply chain and focusing on that. And our agriculture is always going to be high standard, which is a much more lucrative market to be in. We don't want to be in the business of selling cheap meat to countries around the world. We're always going to be high standard. So I think they got everything they wanted. But this idea of tariff-free, quota-free is incredibly important. Because there was one idea that was suggested by DEFRA, which was, frankly, from a trade policy perspective, a really dangerous idea, which is this idea of if you can prove that you're above a UK standard, then the tariff is at one level, and other products tariffs at a different level, a higher level, this sort of dual tariff system. And which George definitely promoted. And the problem is, of course, a dual tariff, like everything else, a price cap always becomes a price floor. It will become, there will be nobody at the lower tariff. It will be, everybody will be at the higher tariff. It never is a dual system. It's always the higher tariff system. So this commitment to tariff-free, quota-free is incredibly important, and many of our trading partners have picked this up. Australia, New Zealand, others have said it is really significant that a major G7 European nation has committed to this, even though it's 15 years and it's with these so forth. There's at least a notional commitment that we're going to be tariff-free, quota-free over
Shanker,
time.
What did you make of the specific attack on Crawford Faulkner, who is the chief trade negotiator on these deals and now the interim permanent secretary to DIT? Was, as was noted at the time, quite extraordinary to be attacking by name an official on the floor of Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I thought it completely outrageous that a civil servant who cannot respond, who George Eustice knows perfectly well cannot respond and cannot defend himself, was attacked in this way by a politician. The second thing I would say is that Crawford Faulkner knows more about trade policy in his little finger than most people in the UK know in their entire experience. Crawford Faulkner was regarded and is regarded by trade policy practitioners who actually have some experience, and by that I mean people with like 30 years experience of trade negotiations, as the star of the field. He was chosen to be the chairman of the WTO's Agriculture Negotiation Committee because he was seen to be so good at what he did. He is a huge asset for the UK. Frankly, the UK is lucky to have him. And if I were Crawford and getting all of this abuse, I would wonder, why am I giving my time to this country? The ingratitude of people like George Eustice and politicians to have an asset like this in the UK, without whom they wouldn't be able to do any of the trade policy stuff. One of the things that Crawford has done is really built some really, really good negotiators in that department, in DIT. Now, that doesn't happen overnight with no experience. It's because negotiators know they can go up the corridor and say, look, Crawford, I've got this problem. What do you think? And you're learning from the best in the world. This is a huge opportunity for UK to upgrade itself. Now, we have to be very clear about why George Eustice is attacking Crawford in this way. Clearly, he feels that if he can remove Crawford Faulkner, then he can remove the UK's liberalising role in international trade. Well, once you've removed the UK's liberalising role in international trade, and it effectively has no trade policy, and once you've basically ensured that you've locked down, SPS rules in the way that is suggested, then you have no gain. You have no gain from this process. And ultimately, there's only one way that leads, which is back into the EU, but back into the EU on sort of considerably unfavorable terms, I would imagine. So Crawford here, I think, for people like George Eustice, represents it's not the man. He represents a stream of thinking that for their goals to be achieved, which is alignment of regulation to the EU and no real change from the EU's protectionist approach on agriculture, this man represents a colossal threat to that. And if you can remove him, then you can win. And I think there's a lot of that going on. There is the final point I'd make about Crawford is you have to have a strategic global trade policy. It's not just about a narrow economic gain for a particular producer here or a loss to a producer there. There is a global strategic approach here. Your trade policy is part of your foreign policy, and it is extremely important that the UK plays this liberalizing role in a world which is increasingly becoming protectionist, which is increasing its levels of regulatory protection and regulatory barriers. We have market distortions in China that are increasing massively. We have market distortions in other countries that are increasing. If we all retreat into this protectionist regulatory shell, then what is the danger to the world here? The danger to the world is a severe reduction in global welfare, a reduction in global wealth. And of course, the people who pay the biggest price for the reduction in global welfare are people in developing countries. You know, they're the ones who are, you know, it's almost like a ship that starts to take on water and starts to be submerged. It's the people in the bottom layer of the boat that end up drowned first, and that's what's going to happen to developing countries if we continue on the path that we're on. And Crawford recognizes this because he's been working in all of these things for 30 years, and that's why the UK was welcomed so much by the community of trading nations after Brexit. That's why people said, you know, this is great to have a major G7. And I'll just finally give you an example of a chairman of a major pharmaceutical company who said to me, foreign company, who said to me, I've paid for the cost of Brexit. I've done all the things I need to do. I've set up these offices all over the EU. Now I want to see the gains of Brexit. Now I want to see you having medical and pharmaceutical regulation that is pro-competitive and not burdensome. Where's that? That's what I want to see now. And that's far more important to me than the sort of relatively minor but annoying cost that I've had to pay for for your decision to leave. But if I'm not going to see any of that gain, then all I have is to show for this is the minor and irritating cost of having to reorganize everything, which, if there's no gain, starts to look not so minor and not so, you know, merely irritating.
Well, Shanker, on that note of optimism about Brexit and about global Britain, in terms of not that the vision has necessarily been fulfilled, but there is a vision there and there is an opportunity, and so much more to be done. I think I might get you back in future to have a little bit more chat about India and CPTPP and all these other opportunities. But for now, thank you so much, Shanker, for joining the IEA podcast. For those who've been enjoying this podcast, I do encourage you to subscribe on your chosen podcast provider or on the IEA's YouTube. And if you're enjoying the IEA, please do visit iea.org.uk and you can support our work and become a patron.
Great. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.